I used to believe my life was the kind of life others envied. I had a good job, a stable income, and a wife who stood by me through every season. To anyone looking in, we were the picture of a couple who had it all figured out. People at family gatherings would smile at us, whispering things like, "They're so perfect together." And for a long time, I believed that, too. Her name was Sarah. She wasn't the type to demand attention, yet she carried herself with a quiet grace that people noticed. She laughed easily, spoke kindly, and kept our home warm and inviting. She was the anchor of my world, and I told myself I was lucky. We had been married for nearly 7 years, and by that point, we had settled into a rhythm, one that looked steady on the surface but felt predictable beneath it. The truth is, routine has a way of dulling even the brightest colors. Our mornings blurred into one another, coffee brewing, hurried conversations before work, promises to talk later, that often went unfulfilled. Evenings were a cycle of tired dinners, scrolling through phones, and falling asleep before either of us had the energy to ask how the other was really doing. I don't think either of us noticed the distance at first. It crept in silently, disguised as busyness. We were functioning, not failing. But functioning can feel a lot like drifting when there's no spark to hold on to. Sarah was still devoted, always thoughtful, always consistent. She would pack my lunch, ask about my meetings, and leave little notes in my jacket pocket when she thought I needed encouragement. And yet, when I looked at her across the dinner table, there were moments I felt like a guest in my own marriage. I saw her lips move, heard her voice, but I couldn't always feel the connection. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was the way I carried the stress of work home with me. Maybe it was the way I stopped reaching out, stopped sharing the small details that once made us laugh late into the night. Either way, I started to sense a shift, not dramatic, not catastrophic, but enough to make me wonder if this was how love quietly faded. I remember one particular evening. We were sitting on the couch, the television casting its blue glow across the room. Sarah was beside me, her legs tucked under a blanket, her phone lighting up her face. She showed me something, a video, I think, but I barely looked. I mumbled something in return, and the silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. It was in that silence I realized how far we'd let things drift. And yet, I didn't say anything. I told myself it was just a phase, that all marriages went through seasons like this. I convinced myself we'd find our way back, that love didn't always need to feel like fire, it just needed to endure. But beneath that rationalization was a hollow space I couldn't ignore. I felt unseen, though Sarah was right there. I felt lonely, though I wasn't alone. And it was that loneliness, the quiet, unspoken kind, that would eventually open the door to something I never expected. Looking back, I wonder if I missed the warning signs because I didn't want to admit them. The subtle avoidance of eye contact. The way I found excuses to stay at work a little longer. The relief I felt when she fell asleep before I came to bed. These were cracks in the facade I didn't dare acknowledge. To the outside world, nothing had changed. To our friends, we were still the couple who had it all together. But inside our home, I knew differently. Our love hadn't ended, it had just gone quiet, buried under the weight of repetition and silence. And in that quiet, temptation was already circling, waiting for the moment when I would be weak enough to let it in. Temptation never enters your life as a storm. It begins as a whisper, so subtle you barely notice it. That's how it started for me. Her name was Claire. She worked in the same office, a few departments over, though our paths rarely crossed until one project brought us together. She wasn't striking in the way that turned heads, but she had an energy that pulled people in. Quick to laugh, sharp in conversation, and always carrying herself as if she had secrets worth keeping. The first time we spoke outside of work, it was harmless. A group of us went for coffee after a long meeting, and somehow she and I ended up sitting at the same table. We talked about deadlines, mutual frustrations with management, the usual small talk. Yet, I remember walking away with a strange feeling, like I'd been seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. Over the next few weeks, our interactions grew more frequent. An email that could have been one line turned into paragraphs peppered with jokes. A chance encounter in the hallway became a 10-minute conversation. She'd ask about my weekend, and unlike the polite curiosity of others, she listened. Really listened. That attention, so ordinary on the surface, began to feel extraordinary to me. I told myself it was nothing. Just friendly banter. Just two colleagues who clicked. But deep down, I knew I was treading on dangerous ground. It was the little moments that drew me in. The way she'd roll her eyes at a bad joke during a meeting, and then glance at me as if sharing a private world. The way her smile lingered a second too long when we said goodbye. These weren't grand gestures, but they were enough to make my pulse quicken in a way I hadn't felt in years. At home, life with Sarah continued as usual. She'd ask about my day, and I'd give her vague answers. I wasn't lying, not yet, but I wasn't sharing the truth either. I didn't tell her about Claire. I didn't mention the laughs, the conversations, or how I started looking forward to work in a way I hadn't in years. And in keeping that silence, I was already stepping away from the honesty our marriage had once been built on. One evening, after we had stayed late finishing a report, Claire suggested grabbing a drink. My instinct was to decline, to head home to the safety of routine. But then she tilted her head, smiled, and said, "Just one. You look like you need it." And I said yes. The bar was quiet, dimly lit, the kind of place where secrets felt safe. We sat across from each other, the conversation flowing effortlessly. She asked questions no one else bothered to ask anymore, about my childhood, my ambitions, the parts of myself I thought had been forgotten. With every answer, I felt lighter, as though someone had lifted a weight I didn't know I was carrying. As the night stretched on, I felt a dangerous warmth in her presence. Not just attraction, but validation. She made me feel important, alive, interesting, things I hadn't felt in a long time. When she touched my hand, just briefly, under the table, I didn't pull away. I told myself it was nothing. But I knew it was everything. Driving home that night, the guilt hit me. I hadn't done anything, not really. But I couldn't shake the thought that I had crossed an invisible line. Sarah was asleep when I walked in, the house quiet, familiar. I kissed her forehead, whispered goodnight, and lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering what exactly I was letting into my life. It should have ended there. A drink, a laugh, a fleeting moment of weakness. But temptation never ends with a single moment. It lingers, it grows, it waits. And with Claire, it was only just beginning. It happened on a night that should have been like any other. A late meeting, a quiet office, the kind of routine that never raises suspicion. But the truth is, temptation doesn't need a grand stage. It only needs opportunity, and I gave it one. Claire and I were the last to leave the building. Rain tapped against the windows, the streets outside slick and gleaming under the city lights. She glanced at me as we gathered our things, her expression carrying that familiar spark I had come to recognize. "Do you want to wait out the rain?" she asked casually, though there was a weight behind her words. I could have said no. I could have walked away, gone home to Sarah, and let the night pass like all the others. But instead, I nodded. We ended up at a small cafe across the street. It was nearly empty, the smell of coffee lingering in the air, the soft hum of music filling the silence between us. We talked, about work, about life, about nothing at all. And yet, every word felt charged, every glance held longer than it should. When the rain slowed, neither of us moved to leave. Instead, we walked together, our steps slow, unhurried, as though we were both waiting for something unspoken to happen. I remember the way her hand brushed mine, lightly at first, then more deliberately. My chest tightened. I knew I should pull back. But I didn't. Her apartment was only a few blocks away. I don't even remember who suggested going there. Maybe it was her, maybe it was me. All I know is that once we reached her door, I was already too far gone to turn back. Inside, the world outside seemed to vanish. The soft glow of lamps, the faint scent of perfume, the quiet stillness, it all felt like a separate reality, one where consequences didn't exist. She offered me a drink, but it sat untouched on the table. The air between us was heavy, almost suffocating, and I felt myself slipping into something I knew I couldn't undo. When she leaned closer, I hesitated for just a second. A single, fleeting moment of clarity where I could have stopped everything. I could have walked out the door, gone home, and carried the guilt of temptation but not the weight of betrayal. But hesitation is fragile, and in that fragile space, desire won. The kiss was the breaking point. It wasn't just physical, it was the shattering of everything I thought I stood for. And once that line was crossed, the rest followed, inevitable and irreversible. I don't remember every detail of that night, and maybe that's because part of me has tried to forget. What I do remember is the way my chest ached afterward, the silence that pressed down heavier than any words could. She fell asleep beside me, her breathing steady, as if nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. Lying there, I felt the weight of what I had done settle into my bones. It wasn't passion I felt. It wasn't joy. It was guilt, raw, suffocating, undeniable guilt. I thought about Sarah, asleep in our bed, trusting me, believing in us. And I realized that trust had been broken in a way that could never fully be repaired. When I finally left, the city was quiet, the streets still damp from the rain. I walked slowly, my thoughts louder than the sound of my footsteps. I knew I couldn't take it back. I knew the man who walked into that apartment wasn't the same one walking out. Something had ended that night, and something else had begun, something darker, heavier, and far more complicated. And though I didn't know it then, that single choice, that single night, would unravel everything I had built over the years. The morning after felt unreal. I woke up in my own bed beside Sarah, the smell of her shampoo lingering on the pillow, the warmth of her body close enough to touch. It should have been comforting, familiar. Instead, it was suffocating. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my chest heavy with a guilt I couldn't shake. She stirred, half asleep, and mumbled, "You're up early." I forced a smile, muttered something about work, and slipped out of bed. I couldn't look her in the eye. Not after what I had done. For days, I carried the weight of that night like a shadow. I went through the motions, work, meals, conversations, but everything felt different. Every time Sarah laughed, every time she reached for my hand, I felt the sharp sting of betrayal. She had no idea, and somehow, that made it worse. The paranoia started small. I caught myself checking my phone obsessively, deleting messages from Claire, crafting responses that sounded casual but concealed too much. I avoided long eye contact with Sarah, convinced she would see the truth written across my face. I told myself I could bury it, that if I was careful, she'd never know. But secrets have a way of poisoning even the simplest moments. One evening, as we sat down to dinner, Sarah asked me a question so ordinary it almost broke me. "Are you happy?" Her voice was steady, but her eyes searched mine with a quiet intensity. I froze, the fork in my hand hovering midair. I could have lied, I almost did. But something in her gaze, something in the way she already seemed to know, pulled the truth from me. The words spilled out clumsily, half confession, half apology. I told her about the project, about Claire, about the night I swore I'd regret forever. I didn't spare myself. I couldn't. By the time I finished, the silence in the room was unbearable. Sarah didn't cry, not at first. She just sat there, staring at me as though I were a stranger. Then, slowly, her face crumbled. The tears came, quiet and relentless, as she pushed back from the table and walked away. I followed, begging, apologizing, desperate for her to understand that it was a mistake, a moment of weakness, not the sum of who I was. But in her silence, I saw the truth: some mistakes can't be undone. That night, I slept on the couch. The distance between us had never felt greater. The house, once filled with warmth, now echoed with the sound of everything we had lost. I thought about the years we had built together, the trust, the promises. And I realized that trust can be destroyed in a single night, no matter how strong it once seemed. In the weeks that followed, we tried. Or at least, I tried. I cooked dinners, wrote letters, begged for counseling. Sarah listened, but her eyes no longer carried the same softness. She was there, but she wasn't mine anymore, not in the way she had been. Looking back, I see that infidelity isn't about a single act. It's about betrayal that begins long before the physical line is crossed. It's about the silence at the dinner table, the laughter shared with someone else, the moments of connection that should have belonged to your partner but didn't. That's where the real fracture begins. And though I can tell this story now, with honesty, the truth is it still haunts me. The memory of Sarah's face the moment she realized the life we had built was a lie, that's something I carry with me every day. I lost more than a marriage that night. I lost the man I thought I was. Because infidelity doesn't just change your relationship. It changes you, forever.